guys, Otterpop here. Welcome to another Dan vs. review. This is the review for Season 1, Episode 20, Dan vs. the Magician. Now, before I get on to anything else, don't forget that the link to the reaction is going to be down in the description below. But first, for this particular review, let's start off with a quick recap of the episode. Dan is humiliated in public, and he vows vengeance on the magician that caused it by exposing him as a fraud. Fair warning, I couldn't really think of a whole lot to talk about for this particular review, so maybe a slight bit short, but let's go ahead and get on with it. You know, I mentioned it in my reaction at least once or twice. I think I went on, some brief rants for a moment too. But the biggest thing that I was kind of thinking about throughout this episode, besides, thinking about Elise, but more on her later, was the idea of, or the concept of, magic versus illusions. It was kind of stated in the episode, although I'm not sure necessarily by whom, that magic was kind of, something for kids. It's kind of fantasy, and it's overhyped, and, it doesn't look real, and it can often come off as sort of scammy, which kind of makes sense. I like using magic for fantasy stories, for, fiction and stuff like that. But in terms of real world, I don't really like referring to people as magicians, and frankly a lot of them don't really like referring to themselves as magicians either. At least the real interesting ones, the ones that are actually really good at what they do. Not necessarily magic, but rather illusionary. That's at least what I call it. Illusionary is targeted at deception of audiences, or at least specific members of certain audiences, which illusionists themselves recognize. It's a little bit trickier and a little bit harder to pull off, and you kind of need to have not really immense knowledge necessarily, but you need to have some pretty intricate knowledge of how to do it, especially when it comes to psychologically based. There are actually plenty of illusionists out there who use some psychological material and they sort of add it into the show to sort of deceive or sway audiences or certain audience members in certain ways. And that's the stuff that I find fascinating, because that relates a little bit more to science and the recognition that, it's not actually magic, it's just deception, or at least misdirection. Even when I was a kid, I was logical enough to be like, oh, magic is, this sort of fictional stuff. It can't exist in the real world kind of thing. So I was just like, man, magicians are, again, meh. But I loved illusionists because, again, they were smart. They recognized that what they were doing, and they knew exactly what it was, and even the audience would sometimes know, and sometimes illusionists would, use the audience to trick certain members of the audience to deceive them, and to make sure that it stayed that way. Because I would know. I've actually been to a show where I saw an illusionist do this kind of stuff to some of the audience members when I was in college. It was really cool, and it was really fascinating. Tickets weren't really all that expensive, and there are a whole bunch of students, so of course they wouldn't be that expensive, but it was really cool. So again, I like those kinds of people, but magicians, no, just don't say that you can do magic. I mean, unless you're doing it for a kid show, then that's kind of fine. They're kids. Kids will believe anything. What was that magician's name in the episode? Magnifico the Magnificent? Ugh, so dumb. He came off as an arsehole very early on. I also didn't suspect early on that he was a fraud or a thief. I don't know. His design, his facial expressions, it really should have given him away. But then he started using crazy, made-up magic terms while he was performing his show, and of course the townsfolk believed it, because these are cartoon bystanders we're talking about. Of course they'll believe that kind of stuff. It's the same with, say, Simpsons, or South Park, or Invader Zim, it doesn't matter what kind of cartoon it is. It's cartoon logic. Audience, townsfolk, regular folk, audiences, bystanders, adults in cartoons they're not always the smartest, and they'll believe just about everything. Not every cartoon is like that. Not every cartoon. But a lot of them tend to be. At least in my personal opinion, the episode seems to riff a little bit on magic, which is kind of what I was doing to it already, even during my reaction, by revealing that magic shows are just scams to get gold jewelry and fancy watches. I mean, I don't know if I necessarily go so far as to say that all magicians, in the real world, are scam artists or something like that, but at this point, most people don't even call themselves magicians anymore, because it's just not a term that works. Magician or wizard, it's a fictional fantasy term, is usually what it's associated with, so, yeah, nobody's gonna believe that anymore. There also seems to be a little bit of a parody in the episode, where magicians have ridiculous or unoriginal names, at least, again, that's kind of in my opinion, but I've seen all different kinds of shows with, magicians or wizards or something, and most of their names are just really random or just very unoriginal. Like, again, Magnifico the Magnificent, or the Amazing Peter, and even I think the names that Dan and Chris came up with, I'm not remembering, like I think it was the Enchanted Chris and Dan the Incredible Amazing or something, I don't know. But they were just lame and unoriginal. At least plenty of, like, some of the legit illusionists, like, use their regular names, which is fine. I mean, not everybody needs a stage name. Okay, technically I have a stage name myself, it's Otterpop, but it's like, it sounds more interesting, and I actually put some thought into it, and there's a reason that I even have that nickname in the first place. I had Otterpop as a nickname long before I ever started this YouTube channel, okay? So, I put some thought into it, and there's a reason behind it, and it at least kind of works. So, shush. The whole parody and riffs on magicians versus illusionists. Well, I mean, technically the only thing was riffs on magicians and magic, whereas I kind of added the illusionist thing because I think that that's a cool aspect that people don't realize is either a thing or is as or it should be more popular kind of thing. But that was one of the two major things that I noticed throughout this episode. The second major thing that I should talk about for this particular episode relates to Elise. She actually plays a little bit of a bigger role in this episode because, surprisingly enough, she has a fear of magicians. We've in the past seen Elise hold grudges, Shakespearean actors that hurt Chris and roadrunners that pecked her unbelievably, but this is the first time that we saw Elise genuinely afraid. Like, she looked terrified when she saw that there was a magician in her house. I've never seen that look on her face before. If anything, this is kind of proof that even despite her badassery and her confident and her strong demeanor, even Elise can be a complex character with crazy histories and fears that may not even necessarily relate to the story. And that can actually be something interesting for characters to have, is to have certain quirks or personality traits or fears that, might kind of play into random bits of the story here and there, or may not even contribute to the story at all, but are still interesting because it makes the characters seem a lot more complex and a lot more real and a lot more grounded in nature. I mean, that's just me talking as a writer, but still. And even when Dan and Chris get into sort of magician-esque outfits, Elise isn't completely, sidelined by fear, and she doesn't suddenly hide away, so that explains her ability to have some courage in showing up at the Magic Manor later on in the episode. Magician Manor? Magic Manor? I don't know. One of the two. It's MM. Throughout the episode, I was thinking, okay, we better get some background information or some kind of backstory on this, and sure enough, we did. But I honestly can say that I can and can't understand Elise's fear given her origin story, because, apparently Magnifico the Magnificent, just call him Magnifico. It sounds even more dumb otherwise. But Magnifico, who is the primary antagonist against Dan and Chris throughout the episode, apparently was also magician at Elise's, 8th birthday party or something like that. And, he did a whole bunch of, the common magic tricks that most magicians would do at kid shows or something like that, where, swords are inserted into the box or, sawed in half and throwing knives at her blindly while Elise is spinning on a wheel, and it's just like, yeah, they're pretty common, magic tricks, or at least tropes of common magic tricks or something like that. I can't fully understand it, but at the same time, if I put myself in the mind of an 8-year-old, of at least 8-year-old Elise, I can kind of understand why a kid would be terrified of some stuff like that, especially if they were the ones in the box or on the wheel getting spun around while somebody blindly threw knives at them. Like, some kids might get terrified, some kids might not, is the thing. That's the interesting thing, but apparently Elise just falls in the category of one of those kids who did get afraid by something like that. But the whole her being part of that magic show kind of made me wonder why in the heck her parents allowed this, especially the knife throwing. Like, I don't know. I've only met Elise's parents, well, significantly twice so far in this series, but I don't know. They just don't seem like the kind of parents that would allow that kind of thing to happen at their own home with their kid's birthday party. It just doesn't sit well with me. But no, still interesting to see Elise have a fear of something that's so simple and mundane. Again, it really kind of fleshes out her character in a weird way and shows that, she's a lot more grounded in nature than, some people might think. Again, that's how I see it from a writer's standpoint, so try not to hold that against me. It's something that probably won't even come up at all ever again, which is okay. maybe there's another field that'll come up again that will be interesting to look into. Maybe it'll have a little bit more like relevance to either the episode or even a couple of future episodes. Who knows? I mean, this is Elise. For all we know, if she's got a fear, she's gonna hide it from Chris, because clearly even Chris didn't know that she was afraid of magicians, so clearly she keeps some things close to the chest. And that's not necessarily the worst idea, at least given her profession. But yeah, those were the two big things. The whole riff on magicians and magic and Elise's fear. There were a couple of other random miscellaneous things that happened in this episode. Like every single episode, there's always little random miscellaneous bits. For one thing, Miss Mumbles makes another appearance. I don't care that I call her Miss Mumbles, and I know that she is a cat that is called Mr. Mumbles, but I'm still gonna call her Miss Mumbles because, I don't know, just something. If other characters want to call her that, then that is totally fine. And by the way, I now knew by this point in the episode that Dan recognizes that Miss Mumbles is in fact a she, but still calls her Mr. Mumbles. So, I don't know, I just consider that to be a little bit of a quirk, so. But it was nice to see Miss Mumbles again. In the initial part of the episode, Chris ends up getting a necklace for Elise for her birthday stolen by Magnifico, hence what kind of partially what kind of drug this plot along for this particular episode. And I would try to make the conjecture that something would happen to Elise's necklace by the end of the episode, but besides the already incorrect engraving on it, like somehow it would be damaged or the engraving would be correct or something like that. And that didn't end up happening. It just, it was still the incorrect engraving, and it, seemed fine otherwise. But at least I'm proud of myself to be thinking outside the box for these episodes, since they often seem to go that route. I mean, come on. Out of all the episodes so far, they've sometimes gone in directions I wasn't even expecting them to go. It's clearly evident by many of my reactions thus far. And one more little question I have. There was a little goblin troll-like creature that was making wands at magic, magician, whatever manner. Do those exist in this world now? I mean, I know that, the Wolfman exists, it's a supernatural creature, he technically exists in this cartoon universe, but do magical creatures now exist? This is the weird thing with cartoons. You just can't explain some of the logic, and some of the world building isn't always there. That's usually sometimes a problem I also have with episodic shows, is that there's no solid world building. Or sometimes there's enough of it at random bits and pieces throughout multiple episodes that I'm like, okay, I can get a feel for what I think could happen, or, what could be possible, but I don't know, for this particular show, trying to get the world building of this particular series is a little bit tricky, and that kind of irks me. That's the only major thing that irks me, at least. But that is literally all that I have for this particular episode, so nothing too interesting, but there are at least a few points in here and there to mention. So thank you all for watching. I hope you guys enjoyed the reaction and the review, and as usual, until the next video, guys, check you laters.